When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. John Muir said that. If you haven't heard of him, you've probably heard of some of the national parks he played a critical role in establishing: Yosemite, Sequoia, Grand Canyon, and Mount Rainier. The climate crisis is a reminder of how very true his words are. For quite some time in the United States, regardless of the political party in power, our military and national security have warned us that the climate crisis is likely to have a profound impact on food supply, water access, global health, and world conflict. A delicate thread binds our global water, food, and health systems. Tug at climate, and you'll find it hitched to the others. Major disruptions in any one of these global systems increases the likelihood of political and social upheaval. Let's start with water. As temperatures rise, it's not just people that drink more water. Crops and animals need more water. So do businesses and industry. More water is also necessary to meet increasing energy needs as temperatures rise. In the 20th century, water usage around the world has increased sixfold, mostly due to agriculture. In almost every country, the statistics are similar. Nearly 70% of available fresh water in the world is used for agriculture, primarily irrigation. Nearly 20% is used for industry, while 11% is spent on domestic use. So we know that rising temperatures increase the demand for water, but here's the thing. Rising temperatures also mean that the supply of available water around the world is reduced at the very same time. Water scarcity already affects more than 40% of people in the world. 1/3 of the population in Nigeria, the most populated country in Africa, have no running water in their homes. In the United States, at least 2 million Americans lack access to safe running water at home. For the people of the Navajo Nation, which occupies an area larger than West Virginia, 3 out of every 10 families lack access to running water. Water scarcity has been a long-running issue in the Middle East, and it's increasingly becoming an issue all around the world. There are 5 major sources of water for the world's population. Ice and snowpacks, which is the source of nearly 69% of global fresh water. If none of the rest of you will say it, I will. Who knew we got most of our fresh water from ice and snowpacks? Underground aquifers, lakes and rivers, man-made reservoirs, and forests. While ice and snowpacks provide the majority of fresh water globally, forests are the single most important source of fresh water in the United States. They provide more than half of our drinking water. Don't lie, you did not know your water came from forests. Neither did I. Of those 5 sources of global fresh water, we already know that ice and snowpacks are melting quickly in higher temperatures. 1/4 of the world's population get their water from the Himalayan glaciers, and between 1/3 and 2/3 of those glaciers are now predicted to melt by the year 2100. In Kyrgyzstan, Central Asia, scientists caught on video a glacier collapse in the Tian Shan Mountains on July 8, 2022, that followed unusually high temperatures in the region. "Oh God," you'll hear them say. "Oh dear God." Luckily, they survived.
Oh God. Oh dear God.
We also know groundwater aquifers are losing water, particularly in the tropics, but elsewhere as well, including the United States. And we know lakes and rivers are in danger as temperatures rise. Here's the largest lake in Iran, Lake Urmia, disappearing over the last 40 years as temperatures have gone up. And here in the United States, the Colorado River is drying up. The Colorado River, a lifeline of the American Southwest, runs 1,500 miles across 7 states and into Mexico, providing water to 40 million people and 4 million acres of farmland. In the summer of 2022, they mandated massive cuts in water allocations from the Colorado River that at one time seemed impossible to fathom. And when we have less water, we have food scarcity. 346 million people in Africa already face food insecurity due to droughts, crop loss, and conflicts over scarce natural resources. In Madagascar alone, more than 1 million suffer food insecurity as a result of back-to-back droughts. In Somalia, a country also experiencing brutal ongoing drought, that number is 4.5 million people. Check out our global food system. North and South America are the two largest food producers of the world. Depending on the year and the season, that's also true in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And it's historically been true in Australia. But the rest of the world, Central America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Western Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, they're chronically in food deficit. What that means is it's all globally connected. Yep, there's that thread again. If there's a problem with food production in one of the surplus areas, no worries, the world can absorb it. If there are problems in more than one area, well, that is a problem. We now face the risk of what's called a multi-breadbasket failure. If you're like me and you aren't totally sure what that means, it's when major yield reductions in staple crops like rice, wheat, or corn happen simultaneously across agricultural areas. Here's an example. When Russia invaded Ukraine in early 2022, exports of wheat were halted for a time. Russia and Ukraine together produce about 1/4 of the world's global wheat export. So when that happened, the Prime Minister and other folks in India said, "Oh, this is a great opportunity for us. We'll fill that gap and export more wheat to the rest of the world to make up for some of the losses from Ukraine and Russia." But then India had an enormous heat wave in March and April, and their wheat yields were cut by 50%, leading them to halt nearly all food exports out of the country. Meanwhile, the upper Midwest of the United States and Canada, who together produce another 1/4 of the world's supply of wheat, were themselves enduring a historic drought that significantly cut their wheat yields. So that, my friends, is a multi-breadbasket threat. There are so many ways that the climate crisis impacts global food supplies. Let's just start with some of the most obvious. Here in the United States, just a few years ago, farmers were unable to use 20 million acres of land ruined by warming-induced flooding because, well, you can't farm on land that looks like this. Or this. Or this. You also can't farm easily on land parched by drought or scorched by fire. A lot of people are surprised that the biggest single cause of death from the climate crisis is from the heat itself. Well, the biggest impact on the food system is from heat, too. Higher temperatures impact crop yields. This is already happening in the tropics and subtropics. The 4 main food crops that supply 2/3 of caloric intake for human beings have significant crop yield declines with each degree of higher temperature. You want to know who does like higher temperatures, though? Pests. It's not just the extreme weather and higher temperatures that they thrive in, but the higher carbon dioxide itself, which is beneficial for a whole bunch of pests we don't want. In 2021, locust swarms ravaged food crops in Kenya. And that same year, an invasion of pesky grasshoppers, together with drought, destroyed crops in the Midwest United States. In a period from 2019 to 2022, locusts of biblical proportion swarmed 23 countries across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. If you really want to get technical about it, when swarms affect several countries at once in very large numbers, it's known as a plague. In Africa alone, invasive pests and plants cause billions of dollars of damage every year. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate warned us several years ago about the impact of the climate crisis on agriculture. Can we just take this in a minute? There may be a threshold of global warming beyond which current agricultural practices can no longer support large human civilizations. Damn. And just when you think you've heard the worst of it, 80% of Napa Valley's Cabernet crop was lost to fire and smoke damage in 2020. Fire-related losses in 2020 were the highest ever for the region. We lost red wine, y'all. It's serious. Plant diseases also spread more readily in conditions created by the climate crisis. Coffee leaf rust is the most destructive plant disease in South America. In a 5-year period, it caused more than $3 billion in lost profits across Latin America and forced almost 2 million farmers off their land. There was a 20% reduction in the yields of coffee plants in the largest coffee-producing region in Brazil. Wine and coffee? That does feel like the end of human civilization. It's fairly clear that global warming threatens the availability of food, right? Well, it also threatens the nutritional value of the food that is available. Recent studies reveal that as concentrations of carbon rise in the atmosphere, the concentration of essential nutrients, like zinc, iron and copper, magnesium, calcium, they all fall in their concentration in plants, making food crops like rice, wheat, and soybean less nutritious. It's the same in the ocean. The nutritional quality of fish decreases as water temperatures go up. Mark Twain wasn't referring to the climate crisis when he said, "Whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting over." But he sure could have been. Because our global food system is so interconnected, disruption due to climate events can lead to inflation and economic crisis. Remember the Russian invasion of Ukraine that stopped wheat exports at a time when India, the United States, and Canada were also facing serious declines in wheat production due to climate change? It heightened the uncertainty of our food supply all across the world. That issue is a long time in the making, mainly due to droughts affecting key crop-producing countries and residual supply chain issues because of the pandemic. But the Russia-Ukraine conflict brought that issue to the forefront. The impact was felt around the world, but continents and countries whose food consumption outweighs local food production, they were most exposed to global increases in food prices. In Sri Lanka, the government collapsed and the president was ousted in protests against scarcity of food, medicine, and fuel. In Peru, protests against food and fuel costs turned deadly, and the Middle East was hit especially hard because of their dependence on food imports from Ukraine and Russia. In Egypt, the world's largest buyer of grain, dependent on 80% of its imports from Russia and Ukraine, bread prices there rose as much as 50% at the start of the invasion. The country has since turned to the International Monetary Fund for aid. Turkey, Lebanon, and Libya all import between 80 to 90% of their grain from Russia and Ukraine. They too felt the ripple effects, which contributed to soaring food costs and inflation. This is Lake Chad in Africa. It's almost completely disappeared as temperatures have gone up and rains have decreased. Some of the people who used to live in that region went eastward to the Darfur region, and it was one of the reasons for the violence there. In fact, many experts refer to the genocide in Darfur as the world's first conflict caused by climate change, sparked by a rise in temperature and decline in rainfall just as the region's population doubled, creating tension for limited resources between nomadic pastoralists and settled farmers. Over a quarter of people in the world, at least 1 billion people, rely on agriculture as their main source of income. So drought and other extreme climate events threaten not only animals and crops, but the farmers and communities that depend on them. That's a lot of people. The Murray-Darling Basin is a river system that encompasses 14% of the landmass of Australia and is its agricultural heartland. The largest of nearly 24 rivers that flow into that basin is dried up completely. 10% of the total population of Australia depends on the basin for their livelihoods, and its collapse is contributing to both economic and social upheaval. In Syria, they had the worst drought in the history of the Eastern Mediterranean from 2006 to 2010. 60% of all farms there were destroyed, 80% of livestock were killed, and 1.5 million people were driven to migrate to already crowded Syrian cities by this climate-related drought. A million of those migrants then left those overcrowded cities, went across the Mediterranean and into Europe. This created political disruption and triggered a wave of xenophobia. The most powerful billboard in the Brexit campaign in the United Kingdom was this one, with an endless line of refugees, obviously from the Middle East and North Africa, and the slogan, "The European Union has failed us all." The Middle East and North Africa have increasingly uninhabitable areas due to climate, a reality which will surely contribute to the pressure to migrate. These are the uninhabitable zones in dark, and these are the projected uninhabitable areas over the next 50 years. You can see that the tropics along the equator will be particularly impacted as conditions of heat and humidity become unlivable. All of this means that we have to expect and plan for geopolitical consequences of much larger flows of refugees. They are coming. In a 6-month period from September 2020 to February 2021, over 10 million people around the world were displaced by the climate crisis and climate-related extreme events. That's 4 times more than were displaced by war and conflict. You can't turn on the news in the United States without hearing about migrants from south of the border.
They're just streaming across. This is a flat-out invasion.
Illegal invasion at our southern border.
This is an invasion. It's terrifying.
In Mexico, over 1,200 square miles of land are lost each year because of desertification. Yes, that's a word. It's a thing, and it's causing almost 1 million people every year to leave the regions they've always called home in search of food and work. Of course, most of the migrants to the United States aren't coming from our southern neighbors in Mexico. They're coming from Central America through Mexico. You remember Eta and Iota from the last video? Those devastating climate-related hurricanes that both struck Central America in November of 2020? At least 10,000 people from Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala fled the devastation of Eta and Iota and joined the caravan of migrants walking through Mexico to the United States border. They were among the 10 million people globally displaced by climate change in the 6-month period that I mentioned. Hurricanes Eta and Iota are part of a broader trend of climate-related events that have pushed Central American migrants northward. The respected Lancet Commission estimates that warming temperatures and extreme weather will force an estimated 3.9 million climate migrants to flee Central America over the next 30 years. The reason they're leaving is because their families are hungry. By the end of the century, we could have up to 1 billion climate migrants across the world. Here's a final tug on the thread. There are also serious health risks for people because of climate change. The World Health Organization has warned us that the climate crisis is the #1 health threat of the 21st century. Late last year, 39 global health organizations signed an open letter urging political leaders in the world to take up and deal with the health consequences of the climate crisis. We know that burning fossil fuels releases carbon into the atmosphere to cause global warming. It also pollutes the air we breathe. 9 million people die of air pollution every year, the equivalent of multiple pandemics. China, India, and Indonesia are areas with the worst problem. I'll never forget waking up in Beijing and looking out the window at the most surreal sight of air pollution. Poland has a problem as well. They burn the most coal of any European country. A baby born in Warsaw today will inhale the equivalent of 1,000 cigarettes in the first year of his or her life because of air pollution that comes mainly from burning coal. This is the biggest coal-burning plant in Europe. The World Health Organization says 50,000 deaths could be prevented each year by stopping this pollution from the burning of fossil fuels. Here in the United States, more than 40% of people live in counties that don't meet the clean air standards established by the Environmental Protection Agency. And more than 1 in 10 deaths in our country is due to air pollution from the burning of fossil fuels. Children face mental health and cognitive risks from air pollution. And for older folks, air pollution is linked to dementia and cognitive decline. But of all the health impacts of the climate crisis, it's actually heat that kills more people in most countries. Remember the Pacific Northwest heat wave of 2021? Here are the hospitalizations during that time. In the Southwest, agricultural workers are particularly at risk. They're 35 times more likely than others to die from heat-related illness. And in the Southeast, they're projecting that many outdoor agricultural jobs will become unsafe by 2050 due to extreme heat. Global warming does, though, make the world better for weeds and pollen-producing plants. Allergies are projected to be much worse in 20 years due to higher pollen counts in the air, a 2.5 times increase. It also makes the world better for infectious disease. As we move into previously wild areas of nature, like rainforests, we come into more contact with infectious disease. It's the primary reason 5 new infectious diseases emerge each and every year. 3/4 of them come from animals to humans, so-called zoonotic diseases. Here's an example in Indonesia, where they've seen that for every 1% increase in the destruction of forest cover, there was a 10% increase in malaria cases. Tropical diseases like dengue fever and Zika are moving away from the equator and toward the poles. Air travel has something to do with the spread of them, of course, but the climate crisis is changing the places where these diseases take new root and become endemic. Studies have shown that more than 2/3 of the waterborne disease outbreaks in the United States come in the immediate aftermath of rain bombs and big downpours. And when there's heavy rain and flooding, one potential consequence is septic tank and sewer overflow. This is in Chicago in 2021, when wastewater sewers were overwhelmed by rain and floods and blew the tops off the manhole covers. This is sewer waste coming out. I think exploding human waste is a good place to stop. So you see it, right? That delicate thread that binds everything together: climate, food, water, global health and security. You, me, us, them. Tug at one and you pull the other.